the Lawfare podcast for tomorrow, but we figured we may as well bring you all into the studio because this is just one of those days that you kind of do everything everywhere all at once. So Shane, welcome back. We don't usually double up Lawfare podcast guests on successive days, but you've had a heck of a 48 hours.
Yeah, it's been a week. And it's only is this Wednesday? It is Wednesday, right?
It is Wednesday.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start. Just bring us up to speed. As of yesterday, we had Jeffrey Goldberg's story in which you were kind of named eminence grise, but were not on the byline. And then yesterday evening, or sorry, early this morning, you guys released the texts of the Houthi PC small group signal group. So walk us through your decision to do that. Why was stuff that was too sensitive to release yesterday appropriate for publication today?
Well, and thanks for having me. So on Monday, when we launched our first story, we showed some screenshots of the text, we quoted from some texts, and then we, as you say, kind of left out things that were more sensitive, that we deemed were sensitive. And I should say, like we deemed, I mean, like I thought common sense indicated they were sensitive and were not the kind of things that would ordinarily be, made public by government officials. So we described that information. And then, two very curious things happened. One was that across the government throughout the day, officials, including the White House press secretary, the CIA director, the DNI, and ultimately the president himself, said that nothing in the Signal chat was classified. It was all unclassified, they said. And the second thing that happened was many of these same officials, including the president, insisted that we were somehow trying to deceive the public with our description of what was in these texts, that we were effectively lying to people. And I think you captured this, Ben, yesterday in a piece that you wrote. When you have the entire national security establishment saying there is nothing classified in these texts, okay, well then there should be no problem releasing them. And then we also felt that, we felt that our own credibility was being questioned, and I think wanted to defend that. And we can talk through more if you want about in the weeds of deciding to do this. But those were the two reasons that we decided that we were leaning towards yesterday of publishing them in their entirety, which we did today with one very small redaction.
Right, and let's talk about that redaction, so even here on day two, you guys are being more cautious than the entire national security bureaucracy of the United States, including the CIA director. So describe the narrow point on which you are still holding out on us.
Right. So the CIA director, John Ratcliffe, in the thread, when Mike Waltz asks the group to essentially nominate someone who's their point of contact from their agency, John Ratcliffe offers the name of the individual who is serving as his chief of staff currently. And he prints that person's full name. And there are other officials who sound off and give their names too. We did not print that in the first instance because we had reason to believe that that person was, and we confirm this, is an active intelligence officer. There was some question in our mind of whether this person was undercover, but we knew her to be an active intelligence officer, so we didn't put that in there. That's the kind of thing that we often don't include. And then Director Ratcliffe, I would note, came out yesterday, said there was nothing wrong with putting this name in here. In the thread, that it was not a secret, this person's not undercover. And yet, if you read our story, you will see that we, at the CIA's request, still did not publish that name. So the director, just to be clear, is saying publicly this person's not undercover. Good, glad we've established that. There was nothing wrong with him putting the name in the chat. Got that, but still doesn't want us to print it. And we're respecting that because this individual has a career of her own. She didn't say anything in the chat at all. And that is the one narrow exception that we're making because we think that's the appropriate thing to do. And when we asked the CIA, do you object to any information being published? This was one of their requests, or was their request, not to publish that piece.
Yeah, so that's super interesting. Just I'm going to give my impression of this question because it came up in an earlier conversation today. Tell me if your impression is different. My impression is that the name of a CIA officer can never really be classified because there's a birth certificate, there's a, high school graduation record that's going to be in the person's real name. What is classified is that that person by that name is employed by the CIA. Is that your impression as well, or do I have it mixed up?
I don't know whether or not their employment can be is classified. But if somebody is undercover, their identity is protected. They might use a pseudonym when they're serving overseas. And the director was very clear that this person is not undercover. And he did say, she is known to people in the administration. She acts in a liaison capacity. The people who work around her know who she is.
Right. And just to be clear, there is absolutely nothing wrong with her showing up and his referring to her by her actual name in the Situation Room
Right.
or in the agency itself or in the
Right.
context of high side business. The question is, in a signal chat with Jeff Goldberg, is it appropriate to refer to her by her regular name?
That's right. That's right. And, and just again to emphasize, it was the CIA's request that we continue to withhold her name, and we agreed to do that.
Note here how the CIA is overriding the testimony of the CIA director. He says nothing sensitive here, folks. Nothing classified. CIA in conversation with the Atlantic. Yeah, I know he says that, but please don't publish that name. All right, so let's talk about a little bit about today's hearing, which I only heard part of. But the dynamic duo of Tulsi Gabbard and John Ratcliffe were back on the Hill today, this time in front of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and both again taking the view that none of this stuff is classified. And Ratcliffe at one point is outraged that Democrats want to talk about this instead of real threats to America like illegal immigration and cartels. Um, and I, so describe for us, without getting into a debate with the Director of National Intelligence and the CIA director, describe for us what information was actually in this. So what is the difference between the state of the public record today versus yesterday?
The big thing that is included today that was not spelled out in detail in our story on Monday is a portion, is a text that is shared by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, that begins team update. And he goes on to give weather conditions, to say that they're go for mission launch, the kinds of planes and weapons that will be used in the attack, the times that they'll be over their targets, specificity like that. This I think is like, what people are debating our term war plan. And Pete Hegseth has been saying nobody shared any war plans. Pick whatever name you want for it. It is a detailed list of the force that will be being applied by the U.S. military to kill people. Like, do you want to call it that? Does that work for us? He's sharing it in this room. It seems pretty clear. It looks like he's getting it. He's copying and pasting it from some other location potentially. But that was one of the big things that's in there. Notably, when the DNI and the CIA director were challenged on some of this, and I think really was more maybe to the DNI's point, actually, um, by members who were saying, look, according to the public regulations, information of this kind is presumptively classified, at least at the secret level, and under other regulations, the top secret. And her answer was essentially, well, that's up to the Secretary of Defense. He's the one that shared it. I didn't. There's a lot of passing the buck and the hot potato going on right now and pointing the fingers. And you can see people pointing the fingers at Mike Waltz for setting up the room in the first place, and then Pete Hegseth. But, I think so that was one piece,
So wait, because I'm actually at least a little bit sympathetic to Tulsi Gabbard and John Ratcliffe on this point, that it seems to me there's nothing in principle wrong with having a signal group, that as long as you're not sharing classified material on it, but it's approved for certain coordination and other non-high side purposes. And so you set up maybe you should call it something that's a little bit less revealing than Houthi PC's small group. And so you could say, if you're Tulsi Gabbard and you wanted to be completely straightforward about it, you could say, look, there's a problem here, but it's not my problem.
Right.
The National Security Advisor wanted a coordination mechanism that we could all use offline. So, okay, he sets up a signal group. There's nothing wrong with that. I didn't add the Atlantic to it. He did that. And I didn't share any classified material on it. In fact, I'm not even the classification authority for that material. That's you got to ask Hegseth about that. But to do that throws two other people over the side of the bus. If she'd said that, is there a problem with that as an explanation? Hey, I didn't invite Jeff Goldberg and I didn't share any classified information. You're asking the wrong girl here.
Yeah, I don't know that there would be, because I mean that's a defensible point. There are different regs that govern intelligence versus DoD information. And she has given, by the way, multiple different answers about what was shared, unclassified or no intelligence information that was classified. I mean, she's been sort of, having trouble getting one explanation. There's a separate issue, though, for Director Gabbard in particular, which is that regarding this very passage of information that we're talking about, she was asked yesterday, because we characterized the information in our first story, we described it. She was asked directly by senators, did you ever see any information about weapon systems, types of weapons, et cetera? And she said, well, not that I can recall. And so she was pressed today by people saying, is you still your testimony that in the 2 weeks since you were in this room and this message was shared, that you simply don't remember you saw that part of the message? And I thought she had some real challenges, let's say, answering that directly.
She did, although it surprised me a little bit because I would have thought the time difference was, would have been, she was on some kind of Asia Pacific swing at the time. And I would have thought her answer to that could have very reasonably been, I actually didn't see that stuff in real time. But all right, so do we agree that the big problem here, I mean, there's three groups with big problems. There's Waltz, who created the group, added Jeff to it. There's Hegseth, who shared the information. We'll get to him last because I think he has the biggest problem. And then there's the two who just happened to be unlucky enough to have to testify about it the last 2 days, who I think actually have the least exposure, in the sense that
that's true.
It's really embarrassing for them, but they didn't really do very much.
I mean, Tulsi Gabbard barely speaks, and Ratcliffe doesn't talk very much, although I'd love to talk about the one thing that he does say that I think is an issue. But
yeah, so let's finish dealing with Tulsi and Ratcliffe and then go on to the others. So what did Ratcliffe say that you wanted to mention?
There's a portion in the chat where officials are talking about whether or not they should do the attack imminently or whether they should delay by a month or so, and what benefit might come from delaying, more policy discussion. The vice president seems to be indicating that like maybe we need to kind of tap the brakes on this and think a bit more about it. And the director of CIA, John Ratcliffe, says, quoting here, from CIA perspective, we are mobilizing assets to support now, as in the attack, but a delay would not negatively impact us, and additional time would be used to identify better starting points for coverage on Houthi leadership. Okay, that is talking about a number of things. One, when the CIA director talks about assets, mobilizing assets, you can presume he's talking about human assets, which we also call
Right.
spies. He could be talking as well about technical means of collection, but both of these things implicate sources and methods of intelligence gathering. Now, he's doing it I'm not alleging that he is saying we're going to contact the agent inside the Houthis whose code name is X, but he is speaking about assets and mobilizing. And if we had more time, here are the other things we could do, like do coverage on Houthi leadership, and identify better starting points, which by the way would indicate that they maybe don't have the best starting points that they would like. There's a lot contained in that one paragraph. And John Ratcliffe and others have been trying to say there's no sources and methods information. That's sources and methods information.
Yeah, it's not even, I mean, it's worse than that. They're saying there's no intelligence equities at all in the
Yes.
classified space.
And
And
their plan is.
I think merely the fact that the CIA director says, hey, we'd be better positioned in a month,
Correct.
reflects, there's just no way that fact isn't, again, whether it's classified is really up to him. Um, but it's obviously sensitive.
Yes, it is. And I think that a lot of, there are two kinds of counter arguments that the administration is pushing. One is this isn't classified, which is a quite technical argument that some are making. And some of these same people are also, I think, essentially kind of making an argument of this is not a big deal. Oh, what's the problem? I mean, Vice President Vance said something similar where he said, oh, the Atlantic is oversold what was in here. This is like making it out to be like it's a nothing burger. I mean, it's not a nothing burger.
Right.
I mean, John Ratcliffe would never be speaking these words out in public because they are revealing of what the CIA is doing against the Houthis. And maybe he didn't, elaborate beyond that. But the idea that this is somehow a shrug and not that sensitive, I'm sorry, it's just that is plainly not true, and it doesn't even pass the smell test.
All right. So, um, let's then go to where I think the most sensitive material is, which is not in the intelligence space, but in the military space. And it's in the material that Pete Hegseth releases about the what's going on right now or in the imminent future. And by imminent, I mean in the next 2 hours, right? Um, so this again is material totally appropriate to share with everybody in that group, save the one who's there by accident. But do you agree with me that if a private first class, or some computer technician, let's call him Shedward Schmoden, had given this material to a journalist, let's call him Sen Seenwald. And let's say Sen Seenwald had published it in real time, given to him by, you know, Edward Snowden. Um, do you have any doubt that the government would A, consider it classified and B, consider it a prosecutorial priority to put the leaker in prison?
I have zero doubt about that. And not only do I have no doubt that they would prosecute him, even if the information were somehow deemed unclassified, the fact that this person was transmitting it to a journalist would probably trigger the Espionage Act because it is clearly national defense information under the Espionage Act. There's no way that a private or some low-level person does this and does not get punished.
So I guess here is where I'm hung up. Like they seem to be trying to make this technical argument that it's not classified. Um, this kind of information is per se classified, right? It's real time. It's not very specific targeting information, but it is specific enough that if you were the Houthis and you got it, you would know to get your leadership down below ground.
Precisely. You would, as one member of Congress a little bit ago asked at the House hearing, wouldn't, if you were the Houthis and you had this, wouldn't you know to duck? Right. And I would even maybe go a step further than that, which is to say, if you know the time at which these aircraft are going to be over you, and by the way, the administration is trying to claim there's no targeting information in here or location information. They literally refer to the house of a girlfriend of the head of the Houthi missile production line. I mean, that's pretty specific. But my point is that if you had information like this in advance, you knew the platforms that were coming, you could potentially figure out which way they're coming from. They have anti-aircraft capability, the Houthis. That directly puts U.S. forces in harm's way because you know what to look for and when it's coming, and you might try to shoot them down. So again, I mean, getting hung up on this question of is it classified, unclassified, kind of like misses to some degree the severity. Call the information whatever you want to call it. It is highly sensitive and it's revealing. And if it fell into the hands of our adversaries, it would help them, right? The question about whether it's classified or not is not trivial, and it has legal implications. I think that Pete Hegseth is going to have to answer the question. When you put this in the chat, did you declassify it? Did you know it to be unclassified when you did? He hasn't really answered these questions yet. I mean, he didn't have the privilege of finding himself in the hot seat at 2 congressional hearings.
Lucky dog.
Yeah, he's lucky him. He picked a great time to, be out of town. I mean, I'm not being facetious about that. He's on a trip in Asia right now. But, to the extent that Ratcliffe and Gabbard are pointing at Hegseth and saying, look, that information about the planes and the weapons, et cetera, that's DOD information. That's the secretary's prerogative. Then the question to him was, okay, did you know it to be unclassified or did you declassify it when you shared it? And he does have the authority,
Right.
by the way, to do that. He can declassify. The question is, did he? And I mean, and now I fear we're going to be back in the land of like we were with the Mar-a-Lago documents, being like, well, did he just sort of imagine it unclassified?
Well, so no, but I don't
know.
think he gets that defense. So the president is the president. If he makes something public, it is by the fact of that act, he is declassifying it. Now, query whether any of that is true of an ex-president or if you simply steal it when you become the ex-president. That's the Mar-a-Lago case. The Secretary of Defense is an original classifying authority under the executive order, but he doesn't get to declassify something by releasing it. There is still, he still has to make an affirmative decision to declassify it. And so I think the question as a technical matter would turn on how the information came to him. That is, was he briefed on this targeting package in usually the Pentagon works in slide decks, as you know, not in documents. So there's some PowerPoint presentation or something where somebody presented the targeting package to him. And I would be stunned if it doesn't have the words classification, top secret, no foreign on every page of the top of it. If
Right.
he just lifted text out of there and dropped it into a signal thread, I think he's got a problem.
I think he does too, particularly if he did it on a phone that was a personal phone. I mean, there's another kind of weird wrinkle into this is that everybody in that chat room, with the exception of Jeff Goldberg, was authorized to see classified information,
Right.
presumably. He didn't have to unclassify anything. So the idea that if he's now going to argue, well, it was unclassified, well, why would you feel the need to share only unclassified information in a principals committee meeting. Now,
Right.
if you were to say like, well, I knew it because it was on Signal and you can only share unclassified information on Signal, okay, maybe then query why you're even using Signal. But it's very interesting how these officials keep rushing to, the explanation that it's unclassified, there's nothing wrong with it. Why are you limiting yourself to sharing only unclassified information in a principals committee meeting about an active military operation?
Right.
That
Right.
doesn't make any sense. They
And
didn't know the journalist was in the room.
so the hard case would be if you had somehow the information comes to him with no classification markings on it. And I'm not sure why that would happen.
Right.
Um, Sometimes it can be because it's on the high side and, maybe not need to mark it because it's on the high side, right? But usually the markings are there, at least in my limit and understanding. So somehow, I think if you were investigating this, you would really want to see the package that text was drawn from. Or was it oral and he just kind of typed it down? But was he in a skiff when he did it? What's the mode by which this information comes to him is, I think, the question that the classification issue will turn on.
Yeah.
I want to turn to Mike Waltz.
Yeah.
So Mike Waltz is the person who invited Jeff into the room in the first place, and B, has been, I think, most malicious in characterizing the Atlantic's behavior. That is, he's implied last night that Jeff sort of hacked his way in. So I want to ask, is Jeff Goldberg a master hacker? Has he actually figured out how to penetrate Signal?
I gotta say, Jeff Goldberg has many wonderful qualities. I've spent a lot of time with Jeff around computers the past several days, and no, Jeff is not a master hacker. He's
Uh,
not.
all right. So if, the FSB or the SVR or, the Chinese have penetrated Signal, Jeff hasn't figured out how to break Signal and get into all the chat rooms that he wants.
He has not. I don't think Jeff would mind me even teasing him that, thumb drives are a little bit confusing. So
Yeah.
no, he is
Um,
not
all
doing
right.
that.
Next question. Does the Atlantic have a skunkworks like facility, there where like you guys have a team of master hackers working for Jeff, sort of like, the NSA, TAL group, that's getting him into signal groups.
I will say this is a very futuristic looking office, and there's like some kind of weird AI that controls the blinds. But I am not aware that we have like a tailored access operations unit, like, in a secret panel behind the refrigerator or something like that.
Right.
I'm pretty sure we don't.
Okay, because I'm just checking, because this is the National Security Advisor of the
Yes.
United States who made this allegation. We got to run down the components of it. So, as best as you can tell, is it fair to say that Mike Waltz on national television was just lying about Jeff yesterday?
Well, I don't know why he thinks that he is some kind of master hacker or why he thinks he would possess the skill to get into why Jeff would be able to get into his phone. So I can't say that Mike Waltz is lying. Maybe he's a little bit confused. But I just want to point one thing out because Mike Waltz has said that they are going to get to the bottom of how Jeff was added to this group. And I think at one point he used the phrase that maybe somehow his number was sucked into my phone from where I'm not really sure. But there's a very salient piece of information that I would direct readers to and the National Security Advisor to, which is at the top of the chain, which we published. It says the following: Michael Waltz added you to the group.
Right.
I mean, we've all used group threads. I mean, so either Michael Waltz or somebody who was physically handling his phone added Jeff to the group. I mean, it's plain as the nose on your face.
And is your working assumption that there is some other Jeff Goldberg who was supposed to be a member of the group, or do we just not have a working theory for how this happened?
We don't know. I mean, I have seen people float theories, on social media that, there are other officials in the government with the initials JG, could be. People have noted it. Sometimes people will change their initials or only use one initial in a signal group for some added level of anonymity. Is it possible that, when Waltz or whoever was handling the phone and populating the list, maybe their thumb hit Jeff's name and they didn't mean to? We just don't know. But what I find, frankly, concerning is that the person who does know, or who knows the people who know how it happened, is Mike Waltz.
Right.
And he is acting as if there is some kind of, covert operation of which he has been the victim, and they're going to get to the bottom of that. And I think that is bewildering to me. I mean,
Well, it's not bewildering. It's I'm
well,
sorry.
I think he's
You're
being disingenuous.
you're being too generous.
Yeah.
He is the national security advisor to the president, is having there being a very clear record of what happened, which is that somehow he inadvertently invited Jeff in, is trying to divert attention from that by making unfounded and completely implausible allegations and saying it is under investigation, rather than by announcing candidly and publicly what he did and how he made it happen. And I'm sure there's a innocent-ish investigation. He wasn't trying to leak stuff to Jeff Goldberg, I'm sure, but he did. I think the technical term is screw up, and he
Yes.
should be candid about it.
And also the person who agrees with you on that is Donald Trump, who said in a meeting yesterday, the press was there, I think it was in the Roosevelt Room, with Mike Waltz at the head of the table and a lot of other officials. Trump said, he's a good man. He said in other interviews, he's a good man who made a mistake. So the president has said Mike Waltz made a mistake. Mike Waltz has not said that he made a mistake. He's somehow implying that Jeff Goldberg had something to do with this.
Right. All right. So let's talk about the investigative mechanism, because ironically, the investigative mechanism is supposedly coming from Mike Waltz. It's supposed to be investigated
Yes.
in the National Security Council,
Right.
which is not an investigative entity.
No.
Normally, when you have a security breach, uh, you have an internal investigation in the agency, and or the FBI does an investigation, and it certainly does if it reaches a criminal uh, question. So I'm curious what you understand about the investigative mechanism here, because I don't understand anything about it, including who's doing it.
Right. So exactly. So NSC and Trump even said, oh, we're going to get to the bottom of it. But then Trump somehow suggested that they kind of know what happened. I mean, he was characteristically all over the map with this when he spoke yesterday. So NSC is supposed to be looking into it. Tulsi Gabbard, on a number of occasions tried to use that fact as a way of not answering questions about what happened. My understanding is that there seems to be some support building in the Senate Armed Services Committee, chaired by Senator Wicker, I believe, and the ranking member would be Senator Reed, to do and to ask for or to demand an inspector general investigation. Now that would be, I think, totally appropriate. You would expect something like that for the IG to look into it. I'm guessing it would be DOD IG, given their
But that would be
then
weird.
How do they investigate presidential communications?
So the problem with a DOD IG investigation is it's fine for Hegseth purposes,
Yes.
but it's not fine for NSC purposes or IC purposes. You could have a joint investigation, but then between the IC inspector general, the CIA inspector general, and the Defense Department Inspector General. I think some of those have been fired, by the way, so that would make it a little tricky. But even if you could do that, it still wouldn't answer the Waltz Stephen Miller
Right.
question.
Because there really isn't an IG for the president or for the executive office of the president.
Correct.
So, the other avenue here, and the one that is usually what happens when there is a spillage or a leak of classified information or sensitive information or national defense information, is the FBI would investigate it. And sitting alongside Director Gabbard and Director Ratcliffe at these hearings the past 2 days has been FBI Director Kash Patel. Perhaps very glad that he's not being asked so many questions, and clearly being, I'm sure, very glad he was not in the signal chain. He has said that he was briefed on it. He was asked about it by a number of in both hearings, I believe, and has no update or information on whether the FBI is investigating this. I mean, at some point, I suspect he's going to have to answer the question, are you or are you not investigating it, and why? That's the place where you would expect this to go in any normal circumstance, which is not to say that anyone's going to be criminally prosecuted here. But if you're trying to figure out how it happened and you want to have a credible investigation, that's usually the route that you would go. The idea that the NSC, which is run by the very guy who set up the signal thread, is going to do a credible investigation, that's just silly.
Yeah, I mean, as I told you when you were reporting this story, I don't think a criminal case is plausible here
Yeah, I don't think so.
because the disclosure is accidental and they basically never prosecute accidental disclosures
Yeah,
unless there's some wildly aggravating factor. Now, there's a complication here that I think could make that interesting, which is that both the director of national intelligence and the CIA director proceeded to testify about the matter. And let's just say their testimony hasn't aged well in the 24 hours since they gave it. But I don't think realistically you're likely to make a perjury or false statements case either, because there's enough wiggle room about what precisely they were trying to convey.
right.
That said, it has to be investigated.
Yes. Yes. And for them not to investigate it, I think that would be the first really strong signal that we would have received that the FBI in the Trump administration is not going to investigate wrongdoing by government officials or by their friends, that they're just going to ignore it because it could potentially be embarrassing for them. But to be clear, that is not how things are normally done. And I don't like the if the shoe were on the other foot comparisons, but it is useful. If Jake Sullivan had done this, first of all, I think he probably would have resigned. And I think that President Biden probably would have accepted his resignation. There's no question in my mind that Chris Wray would have investigated this, and President Biden would have said, absolutely, you need to
Okay, so you
investigate.
don't need to speculate because, in fact, Jake Sullivan did something roughly not in this ballpark, but at a much lower level of magnitude, which was that he was one of the people who was exchanging emails with classified information with Hillary Clinton on her server, right? And he shows up in the discussion of it. So we know that Jake Sullivan was involved in an accidental security breach involving like this, um, high level officials who were authorized to receive the information, but it was done by less than optimally secure means. Didn't end up in the hands of Jeffrey Goldberg, who was not accidentally CC'd on any of them, but okay. And it was investigated by the FBI. So you don't have to speculate about the shoe on the other foot situation. The shoe, it's a different shoe. It fits differently. It's actually much less bad. But it was on the other foot, and we
Yeah.
know exactly how the FBI handled it, which is much to Hillary Clinton's annoyance, they investigated it.
Right. And when the Justice Department decided not to prosecute, ultimately, we know this from, follow-up reports, including the Horowitz IG report, they did look at the Espionage Act, and they looked at this question of gross negligence under the Espionage Act, which would seem to be, theoretically might be applicable in the case of the Signal Group. And there too, and this is why I think I agree with you that no one's going to get criminally charged here. The question of what is gross negligence, it turns out, is really gray and it's fuzzy, and it's not well understood. There's not great case history for it. The DOJ actually had to go back to the original debate of the Espionage Act, which was passed in 1917, to try and understand what the lawmakers at the time meant by gross negligence. And ultimately, they decided not to prosecute Hillary Clinton. I think that if there were an investigation of this, I would bet that they'd probably come to the same conclusion. Now, I mean, of course, there's a very politically different Justice Department, but if you're just looking at the facts and what happened, and we know quite a lot about what happened because of these texts falling into Jeff's hands, then no, I don't think that they would find a criminal case here.
Yeah, I have very little doubt. And I want to say this, you can hold me to this if and when there's an investigation and it declines prosecution, and a lot of Democrats are upset. I think eventually that's likely to happen. Count me with Pam Bondi on the declination. Here's where I think you get into really dangerous territory, though. There needs to be an investigation, right? I'm fine with the outcome of it being, we've never prosecuted a case like this, we won't. But there needs to be an investigation that finds down to, as close as you can to forensic certitude, what happened, who was involved, what was the degree of spillage, because, realistically, if something gets to Jeff Goldberg, you want to verify that he didn't share it with anybody other than Shane Harris. We know he shared it with Shane Harris, right? You want to figure out you want to have a little bit of a damage assessment. And then you want to look at the sworn testimony of the officials in question. All of that stuff has to be looked at. And I'm fine with the answer, okay, they should all lose their jobs, but they shouldn't be prosecuted. But you can't not do the investigation. And that seems to me to be, was the, as much as she bitterly resented it, it was the right answer with the Hillary Clinton investigation. It's the right answer here too.
Yeah, and another reason for the investigation is to find out, are there other Signal groups or other groups like this, or is this a one-off?
And to deter, since we kind of intuitively know the answer to that question. And actually, Tulsi Gabbard was kind of asked that and conspicuously didn't say no today. That we know that there are, it would defy logic for this to have been the only Signal group, that was ever created involving high-ranking officials swapping classified material would happen to have included Jeff Goldberg. It's probably a practice that is pretty normal since nobody responded to being invited to this. Excuse me, why the heck are you putting me on a Signal group? Shouldn't this be
Correct.
on the high side? No one's doing that. So, there's some deterrent value in people knowing that this is a matter that gets investigated.
Yeah, agreed.
All right, so before I let you go, where does the story go from here, now that you've put it all out there? Are you done?
Well, I think now we want to know whether other Signal groups. So if anyone listening is aware of a Signal group, you could find my secure contact information on Signal at the Atlantic website. I think we want to know that. I think we are trying to understand now too what actions Congress might take. Will there be an investigation? And look, and there is a political story about this that has Washington frothing right now, which is, is any head going to roll here? Is Mike Waltz going to get fired? Will he resign? Will someone near him resign? And what about Pete Hegseth? I mean, he's going to be coming home to lots and lots of questions about his role in this. I mean, he's not traveling with a huge press contingent right now. He's off doing this foreign trip. So I think that political story is probably going to dominate as well. But look, there's also, and I've written about this, and you and I have talked about this too. This is, I think, part of a pattern of the extremely lax and careless approach that this administration has taken to security, to counterintelligence concerns. I wrote a lot recently about all the different security and counterintelligence risks that the DOGE people are creating when they barge into agencies and start knocking around in computers with no regard for the data they're handling. This is, I mean, what we're seeing here is this amazing kind of like laser view of one set of activities around the Houthi strike, but it's part of a broader pattern of carelessness and recklessness. And frankly, going back to the first Trump administration, where the president was, serially, abusive of intelligence that we got from allies, U.S. intelligence equities, and then ultimately, of course, was criminally charged for mishandling classified information. So, I mean, to me, this is the latest chapter in a story that kind of keeps on going, and then we will keep following.
I'll let you go, but I have one last question.
Yes.
Have you or Jeff gotten any additional mysterious signal invites since this story broke?
If we do, you might read about it in the Atlantic.